Welcome everyone to, actually it's our first virtual roundtable from Evident. We're here today to discuss the key findings of our recently released report on AI talent in the banking sector, which was released on Wednesday. Just by way of background, we launched Evident AI Index for banks back in January this year. It's the first public benchmark on AI adoption for banks. And the index is, just as a reminder, it's an outside-in approach, independent assessment of AI maturity. We launched the index with the 23 largest banks in North America and Europe, selected by size. And we are going to, on November 9, release an expanded and updated index, growing our coverage from 23 banks to 60 banks. We're going to take you through some of the methodology. We're going to take you through key findings of the report. But just to remind people who don't know the index that it's based on 4 pillars, and those pillars include talent, innovation, leadership, and responsible AI. There are 142 indicators in the index. And again, it's an outside in, so it's all based on publicly available data. I'm going to introduce you to our great speakers in a minute. I just wanted to say that we're going to try and run it pretty tight, keep us to about 45 minutes, but there will be time, if there are more questions at the end, to stay on and ask and respond to some questions. I'd love to draw you in as we go, so we're going to go a bit of a sort of a question by question, but do jump into the chat. If there's a question, I can draw you in to the conversation, and then you can ask the question directly to us. And I just wanted to introduce you to us and our speakers. Well, I'm Alexandra Musavisadeh, CEO and co-founder of Evident. And we have here on the screen Annabelle, who is co-founder and COO of Evident, and Tim Gordon, who is partner and at Best Practice AI and is co-author of the Talent Report. Thank you very much, Tim. We have Jeremy Palmer with us too, who is senior partner and global co-leader of Quantum Stack AI Labs. And I am now going to hand it over to Annabelle to take us through the first of our findings. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Great to meet you all. I think we're going to have some slides shared in a minute. Yeah, can you go to the next slide, Nicole, if that's all right? I'm sure I've met some of you before, but for those I haven't, nice to meet you. So just to talk about, I guess, what we're covering. So the dark blue cells are the banks that we covered in the January index. The white cells are the ones that we've brought in for this talent report, and we'll be bringing into the November index update. And we've also included 3 payment providers, more as reference points at this point, just to see how they're differing versus the banks, and we will be looking at them in the index in November as well. And to the person in the chat, John, who's already talked about DBS, they're already actually in the report. They're just in sort of in the mix in some of the slides, and we've brought DBS and CBA in, as I think they're doing some really interesting things in this area. So we've brought them in for early looking at the rest of the world, but most of it is focused on North America and Europe at this point in time. Do you want to go to the next slide, Nicole? So I guess the first question is, what do we mean by AI talent? And we spent a long time sort of working out how to define this. And I guess just in terms of the methodology, this is all based on publicly available profiles on LinkedIn. And essentially, we start off by looking at their role titles. And we've defined 240 different search terms in the English language. And we've then translated those into over 10 other languages, and then defined them against these 43 individual sort of role titles in these 6 categories. So there's a lot of detail in there, but essentially, data scientist within AI development would include data science lead, data scientist, senior data scientist, etc. And Alex can answer any questions on that in the chat. But we really looked at the AI development, so the people sort of building and developing models, all the sort of data engineering and data governance that obviously for AI to run on Rails, you need to have your data in order. So we look at those within the AI and data core as well. And then we look at a range of other AI related roles. So model risk, obviously there are very AI specific model risk roles, but we look at the kind of broader gamut of model risk roles in a bank. We also look at quants. There's a question about whether we should include actuaries at some point in the future. And then we look at implementation talent, all sorts of sort of software developers and software engineers. And I also, in this category, we've also included AI product management, because I think there's quite an interesting sort of theme emerging around sort of AI specific product roles. If you go to the next slide, Nicole, yeah, so this is just the overall volumes of roles that we found. We found in the AI and data core, essentially across these sort of 60 banks and payment providers, 46,000 people working in these roles across the banks. And then on the other side, sort of implementation talent, we've only, there are far more, like greater volumes of implementation talent than we've sort of captured here. But just so everyone's aware, the implementation talent just includes people that have sort of specifically referenced that they work with AI or ML in their online profiles. But I think that just to give you a bit of an overview, and I guess if you look at the kind of the bank profiles here, as we'll dive into this in a bit more detail, you can see the sort of volumes of these talent that are working at, US-based banks versus, the Canadian banks, UK banks, and other European banks. And you can see just quite how much talent that the US banks are building. Alexandra, back to you.
Thank you so much. Actually, I would like to bring Jeremy in to, if you would comment on this. I know from your experience at Quantum Black, you've worked with many banks over the years. And so I just wanted you to jump in and sort of look at, what we have here and sort of how you have, sort of what you've seen going, over the years, what you've seen with sort of trends changing in terms of also hiring. Well, we're going to get to hiring in a minute, but I just wanted to see you comment here on this.
No, sure, thanks. I think it's a great start to such an important topic. I would add that, of course, before Quantum Black, I actually spent many years in banking as well. And I mean, I think one of the things that I'm most delighted about is to see this kind of talent, which 15 years ago would have all been seen as kind of back office, is now being recognized and being brought forward. And I think one of the biggest questions for all of us is like, it's not just volume, but how do we position this type of talent? And you referred to some of the roles above, and I would be interested to go a bit deeper in future on things like how many of these people are actually senior in leadership positions. I think the mixture is really interesting. I don't know if you see that changing yet. And I think the last point about implementation is a really, really interesting one. I mean, I think one of the biggest things we see is a shift towards product building internally, not just like AI as a means of increasing efficiency, but actually developing hyper-personalized product and looking at maybe exploring new methods of pricing, content generation, and marketing. So part of which is linked, of course, to the recent explosion in large language models. And I also thought it was very interesting just now you referred to specific specializations in fields like NLP and others. And I would think that's another area where we'll see more going forward. So for me, I think the fact that these people are being recognized at all, the mixture between the different roles, the move towards product, and also another question for the future, I guess, is how they're organized, which I'm sure we'll get a bit deeper in when we get into like where they are and so on. So there's just a few thoughts to get us going, Alexandra. Yeah,
thank you so much. And I think we're going to be talking later on about what to expect in terms of hiring with the use of and the growing use of generative AI, but we'll save that for later. But now handing back over and handing to Tim to take us through the next slides.
Thank you. So we begin to talk about the individual banks and what performance looks like. And I guess the headline, very similar to the index that we discovered back in January, is the sheer strength and domination of the North American banks. And so we've got two axes on this chart. We're looking very much at the AI and data core, so that group on the left-hand side who Annabelle described. On the y-axis, we effectively have the percentage of the total bank headcount who are involved in AI and this AI and data core. So if you like, how AI is a bank in terms of proportion of people who work in the bank who focus on this area. And then on the x-axis, we've just literally got the volumes of those people in terms of understanding how many people are working in the space inside the bank. And we can see on the bottom right-hand side a sort of breakaway group of the big US banks. You've got JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Citigroup. In fact, the top 5 banks are all US. You had Capital One and Bank of America. Together, they make up about 28% of the total population in this group. So you have a real sense of the sheer concentration of talent and firepower that these banks are building up. On the y-axis, we can see that Capital One is the clear leader in terms of the banks. And in some ways, it's interesting to see that Capital One is also followed by PayPal, Visa, MasterCard's in there somewhere. So what you're seeing is some banks which are which are clearly more focused digitally, but also don't have the same, if you like, long, big retail footprint, which clearly has an impact on the numbers. But there's also something in here about the simplicity of their business models. A lot of the big banks are the legacy of a lot of mergers and acquisitions, a lot of corporate work, and also they have a huge number of different business lines. And therefore, some of these simpler banks are able to focus quite strongly on what they're doing. In terms of the European concentration, we can see that BNP Paribas is coming up in terms of the total volume. And interestingly, the Dutch banks are the ones who are making the push in terms of the diversity. So you've got ABN AMRO and ING Group who are coming through in that space. Unfortunately, the UK banks are some way back in the mix, but clearly you can see there's a lot of shift happening in this mix at the moment. Back to you, Alexandra.
Thank you, thank you. Jeremy, it's a great question coming from Jeff in the chat. I don't know if you just wanted to jump in on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a terrific question. It's a very rich one, which it's hard to do justice to in a kind of 1 or 2 minute answer. But I think there are lots of different aspects to it. You ask about center of excellence and hubs. I think how we're organizing ourselves is a critical question. Do we want to have a center of excellence so we ensure all of our learning and innovation is captured in one place and can then be disseminated outwards? Or do we want to have more of a hub and spoke model because of the importance of being close to the business and bringing in, business and customer facing expertise alongside the kind of machine learning or AI expertise? Those are all great questions. And I think everyone's approaching it in different ways, which I think will be interesting to explore further. I think the leadership perhaps is the biggest one of all, because it's not, I think we're all kind of aware of this, that the next generation of leadership, not just in banking, but everywhere, is going to have more tech savvy expertise. It has to. And the interesting question is, are we breeding that next generation of leaders as well as including their thinking today? And the answer is, I would say more and more, the answer is yes. And I would actually suspect, Alexandra, that that would be an interesting correlation, if not causation, to look at in terms of the overall index. I would suspect that as you bring in more obvious leaders leaders in more obvious positions of leadership with this expertise, you will start to see the impact on strategy. And I think there are some examples that I can think of where you can see where, the deep personalization, the kind of always on customer contact, where you're using lots of models, that kind of differentiated customer service and the growth related to it will often correlate, I would suspect, with places where you are seeing, data savvy, if not AI savvy leadership combining with the traditional business leadership. So I think it's a really rich theme.
I mean, is this something, Jeremy, before we jump to the other slides, is this something you're seeing accelerating over the last year? Is that changing rapidly, or is it a bit of a question around vision?
I think it's very varied. It's the old gag about, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. I mean, I think the places that are moving fastest are where the leadership of the bank themselves, even if they're not AI savvy, have explicitly sought out people to come and sit at that strategy table, which I think is Jeff's point, and say, look, let's think strategically about the data we've got and the opportunities we have to exploit these opportunities from AI and machine learning. And then I think you see, and the big question then is, so the question about center of excellence is it something which is centrally driven? I mean, then you get into mundane questions about like where budgets are attributed. But I think having alignment between the business and the technology capabilities is, in what we have seen, one of the biggest differentiation points in terms of people being able to move faster and see value from this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. That sort of direct connection.
In other words, exactly. In other words, you really want to avoid just being tech forward all the time. It's not like we've got this really cool tech and we've got more and more tech people. It's also, are they linked into leadership and strategy? And are we thinking across the board about the opportunities as we deploy this talent in future?
Yeah. So interesting. And by the way, please do jump into the chat. Our excellent colleague Alex Inch is manning the chat, being chat host today. But back to you, Annabelle. You're going to take us through some of our data on hiring. So back to you.
Yeah, before I do, I was just going to say we're going to be, if anyone's particularly interested in that topic, we're going to be publishing a major report on sort of leadership late September, early October, really looking at the archetypes of different centers of excellence and operating models. So if anyone's particularly interested, do get in touch with us. We'd love to kind of collaborate or discuss different ideas there. But back to talent. So just looking at sort of talent growth in the last kind of 5 months or so. We've obviously got some new data coming through from the last couple of months, and it looks like it's accelerating even more. But I guess what we found initially was that, as though, even in the press, you talk about sort of job cuts, hiring freezes, banks are definitely continuing to invest in AI. And we've just taken sort of 4 specific areas. So data science, model risk, data engineering, and quants. And I think on the whole, we find that the AI and data core has grown by 4% sort of in that 5-month period, but data scientists are outgrowing the market. I would say there's quite a lot of variation by bank. Some banks actually definitely appear to be falling behind. Other banks are doubling down more than others. But that's in terms of overall talent in the bank today. And then I guess if you go to the next slide, Nicole, the other element of this is looking at job descriptions, which is something that at Evident we do on a monthly basis. We're tracking this across all of the banks. And similar to the slide Tim was showing earlier, on the x-axis, it's the total number of AI-related job descriptions, just from February to April this year. So it's only a 3-month window, and we are obviously building and tracking. And on the y-axis, it's proportion that are AI-related. And again, it's a really similar story. The bigger American banks are definitely doubling down on volume. JP Morgan ahead of the pack. And then on the y-axis, PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, Capital One. But you've also got ING, who is a strong performer in terms of density of talent, also a strong performer in density of new job descriptions. But Barclays, interesting, doubling down, and Deutsche Bank as well. We see Deutsche Bank really doubling down in terms of new JDs posted, typically sort of more outside of Germany, so in India, but also in the UK. And we'll be tracking that. And I guess just the final thing before I hand it back is just in terms of, a couple of findings with generative AI, we're not seeing, reams of new positions referencing large language models and generative AI. There's good questions around what talent do you need to harness generative AI? And I think at this point in time, many banks are still identifying use cases, or most people have identified a lot of use cases already and are beginning to think about how to carefully put it into production, I was going to say. And the other thing is responsible AI with, the heightened awareness of risks in the sort of public narrative. We're not seeing the evidence of that many new responsible or ethical AI roles. And that might be because, in the European banks, we find responsible AI tends to get embedded in data ethics anyway, but we haven't seen as much evidence of that as we would have perhaps expected. Alexandra.
Jeremy, I'm just going to go back to you again, because because the interesting thing is that, when we sort of got this data in, we were expecting to see some bounce in, I don't know, prompt engineers or something reacting to the release of large language models, but it's not showing up, and it's not showing up now for very obvious reasons that, as Annabelle was mentioning, it takes a lot longer. You've got to get your data in order. There's a lot of testing going on. It's used internally. A lot of talent exists in the bank that can actually address the sort of experimentation with the large language models and so on. In your view, how long will it actually take before you sort of see generative AI really coming through?
Well, I mean, a couple of points there. I think, as many of us on the call know, I think, large language models have been around for a while. They didn't just suddenly appear with ChatGPT. And I think deep learning expertise can be redirected quite rapidly. I think on the previous slide, Annabelle, I think it does link to this distribution of roles. And I think, for me, you refer to prompt engineering. I think there are a number of contextual roles which are required in order to actually get value from data science. And what we see a lot of over the years is people starting to go very heavy on data science and then gradually realizing that the data engineering part is often the bigger challenge, and then figuring out the right collaboration mode between your kind of business owners and users who can say, if only we could solve that problem, we could deliver a better service or be more efficient. So the business users, the data scientists who can say, well, these techniques are the right ones, and let's try and find the right models. But then you need the end-to-end stuff that Annabelle was talking about. And I actually think that the data engineers is a category that will become even more in focus, especially as the other trend which we see, which is more open source stuff coming along. And again, everyone's context is different, right? I mean, some people will want to have everything in-house, the larger people. But in future, I think there's going to be A, more open source, and B, more focus on context. And I think that's where the large language models will take us. But it's very hard across these categories. I mean, on the previous slide, kind of, the risk side of things is obviously, model risk is obviously a very specific category, which has been there for a while because of things like, capital models and things like that, but is now having to be redeployed to look at, the MLOps side of things more generally. So I think the balance between these roles is interesting. And I think it's how in the banks, we kind of run ourselves to be able to, and I think, again, I'm sure everyone in the call knows this, but this space is moving all the time. So I think one of the interesting questions is, are we helping all of our experts continuously stay up to speed with what is relevant today, what the new open source tools are, what the new capabilities are that we can deploy, and therefore having a workforce which is specialized in the space, but also moving as fast as the space is so that we can get value in our individual context. I don't know if that kind of resonates with other people, but that's how I think about it.
Yeah, and please do jump in with questions, but I think that's definitely what we're, when we're talking to the banks, that, this question around open source was not really, I mean, it was there in the beginning, but not so much. And now it's definitely something everyone's looking at as an alternative to the other models. But I want to hand over to Tim to take us through some of the really interesting data on the talent locations and flows and what's happening in that area. So over to you, Tim.
Thank you. So partly to answer Jeremy's questions around some of these structures, but also just trying to understand the balance of where AI is happening. We've done a sort of high-level search around the geography to try and understand where people are based and where they're living. Clearly, it's probably not a surprise that the US, given their strength, is quite so clearly the leading market in terms of talent, in terms of where they sit. But perhaps slightly more surprisingly, India came in at number 2. Now, remember, we don't have any Indian banks in this mix. These are all US or North American and European banks. But because of the legacy of outsourcing IT decisions we take over the past 3 decades, we can see there's a series of pretty significant cities where large concentrations of AI talent in India. And India, in many ways, is the sleeping superpower of the AI story here. Third, then, is London. You've got Canada coming in next, Paris. And if you look at the top 10, what's interesting is maybe some of the emissions. So Germany is not in the top 10. Germany is in the mid-teens. Italy's not in the top 10, despite having several banks there. Someone like Poland in the European context is number 7. That's very much because Poland has become an outsourced center for a lot of AI talent in the European market. So a lot of the Dutch players, for example, have got people in the Polish market. Perhaps we can move to the next page, but just one thing worth bearing in mind as we jump is the focus on the cities. You look at the cities, we can see that actually it is not such a clear story that the US is so far ahead, or the New York is necessarily so far ahead. Here we've done this by all AI related talent. So this, if you like, is the 100,000 bigger group as opposed to the smaller group of AI and data core staff. If we look just at the AI and data core staff, Toronto nudges just a little bit ahead of the other markets. And if you cut the data a bit differently, for example, putting quants in, London then jumps to the number 1 slot. So you have a series of different ways of cutting this data, of which the message generally is there isn't such a clear winner or leader at this stage at the moment in terms of which bank, which city is the single biggest center of AI talent. But take a step back, and there's some very different models we can see emerging. So what we've got in terms of the coloring inside the charts is where the employers in those markets. So in Paris, for example, pretty much all the employers are French banks. In Toronto, all the employers are Canadian banks. And we can therefore see very domestically focused markets where a huge amount of the work and all the various elements of the talent stack are taking place in a very concentrated way for a domestic set of markets. New York's a bit different. New York has obviously got a big concentration of US banks, and then some other mix of people in who might be more likely to be focused on the quant side. And London is the one that really stands out, because London is the one where actually the majority, also the plurality of staff are US banks as opposed to UK banks. And you can see this remarkably competitive market where a lot of players are taking part, where you've got Deutsche, UBS in terms of big European players, and the UK players are there, but consistently have to compete in their home market for the best talent that they can get. Rounding off the top 10, you've got 3 Indian cities, which mostly employ US bank staff, but equally have some in Bengaluru has a mix of particularly French and British, and then 3 American cities, which once again are very focused on on US markets. Amsterdam, the final one in the top 10, is very much focused on the Dutch market. But taking a step forward to the next bit, what I think this tells us, the next slide, please, is that a lot of the decisions that have been taken around AI talent, where AI talent is based, are not necessarily strategic, centralized decisions. To some extent, they are a legacy of decisions that have been taken over quite a long time period in terms of where staff sit. So one example we put out is Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo has AI staff in over 100 cities in the US alone. And so you can very clearly see that there's a bottom-up recruitment, there's a series of decisions that have been taken, probably historic decisions, that have given that distribution of staff across the mix in different places.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's so interesting. And it's interesting in the US context too, because as banks have hired maybe more, I mean, still not a huge amount, but more from big tech, that you would imagine that maybe a city on the West Coast would have shown up, but it didn't. It was actually the AI bank talent in the US predominantly sits in New York. So I think that's actually quite interesting. And also the fact that Germany is not there, I think that was definitely a surprise. But Jeremy, I would love to get your thoughts on the location, if you wanted to comment on that. Just also in terms of, I mean, as Tim said, there's a legacy question here, but there's also a cost question or potential considerations around cost going forward, and the AI talent also changing in the various locations, maybe also in India. So maybe there are more and more things that you can outsource that they will outsource. How do you see that going forward?
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, a very rich topic. There is some legacy here. Hiring software engineers in India, back office support. Actually, we've learned this ourselves in Quantum Black as we've scaled over the last 10 years. And now we have a significant proportion of talent in India. And I think it's really interesting to reflect on what this means for the future. I think, again, some of this comes back to the leadership question. What I think is interesting is that, the kind of skills that we need are not just technical skills. They're also around collaboration, and how we can get people to work together. So I think there is a cost question, absolutely. And I think, the big C's that we always talk about, cost of compensation, culture and community and collaboration, all these questions are issues. I'm actually not that surprised by the lack of Germany, actually, because I think, there's neither a center of leadership, nor is there a kind of long tradition of like, well, I'm not saying there's not talent there is talent there, but it's just not often deployed in this way. What I think is interesting is what to reflect on, how do you maintain, especially in today's world with a lot of remote working, the right kind of community and culture, which is so important to this talent, by the way, not only for it to be productive by way of collaboration and being close to users and, bringing different experts, diverse experts together in product teams or whatever, but also in terms of, motivating it and so on. So I think my prediction is this is an area where we're going to see a lot of change. And I think everyone is kind of thinking again. There's a lot of interesting things. I mean, Toronto is super interesting, not just because of Canadian banks, but because of the focus of the academic community that we have there around the Golden Triangle, and the fact that there's that great history of machine learning innovation there. So there's a bunch of interesting questions here to dive into. But I think the big message to me is like, how do we manage the cost point, distributed teams, and maintain culture and community and collaboration going forward?
Thank you, Jeremy. If I may just add a bit to that, because I think, and everyone please jump in and comment, but that question around Toronto brings up the question around, and London for that matter as well, but that interplay between the government AI strategy, the areas that they focus on, and how that supports the businesses that operate in that environment. And the Canadian government is famously focused on facilitating AI adoption in Canada, and supporting the universities' collaboration with businesses being able to build those relationships maybe more easily than elsewhere. So that's and then the sort of the centralization of the financial services sector in Toronto, combined with a really great university, sort of definitely sees that feed off each other is really interesting, and food for thought, of course, for the UK. But the one other question I just wanted to throw back to you, Jeremy, was there is Tim's point about being operating in lots of different markets. Now, Wells Fargo here on the slide operates in many cities across the US, but HSBC all the way on the other end, operates across many, many different countries and jurisdictions. And I'm just wondering if you would, the ease of operation, the sort of slight, fragmentation can both be a real positive, because you've got, access to lots of different type of talent, and but it can also, that complexity can also be, be an issue for a bank, or something at least that they have to contend with in terms of tech spend and AI spend and so on. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, we also have the kind of cyclical effect here, and I think the demand for this talent is definitely continuing to strengthen across the banking sector, and we see that in every geography, as is the tendency towards remote working, more collaboration. But the other big thing that's happened, of course, is the changing dynamics in terms of the tech scene demand for similar talent. So whereas a year ago or 2 years ago, all of us were competing, with all the big names on the West Coast, a lot of that talent is freed up now. So I think whoever you are thinking about, how to take advantage of that freeing up of a particular data science talent and harnessing it is a really big question. I personally think we are moving more and more, and I see more and more of this happening to, wherever possible, balancing, centers of excellence and communities, rather than having too much distribution of talent when it comes to, if you think about teams building things together, if you think about training, if you think about community, I think having critical mass in a few places and distributed leadership makes more sense to me. And I think it's harder to run these teams when they're fully, dispersed all over the world.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Jeremy. I'm going to hand back to Tim. One of the hot topics, many of the hot topics in the report is about how the talent flows between banks and a question around poaching. So I'm going to hand back to you, Tim, on that.
Great, thanks. I mean, just to touch briefly on the earlier point that you mentioned, the Bay Area and San Francisco. It's striking actually how limited resources are deployed in the Bay Area at the moment. I think it's Wells Fargo and PayPal are the only two significant staff teams in that area. We've also just evidence is now tracking salaries in the sector. What we're seeing is an interesting conjunction where San Francisco is amongst the highest salaries in the world, but also when we look at the Glassdoor ratings, they're by some margin the grumpiest employees. So there may be some various barriers as to why people would move there, even as the talent comes free. Look, I think we've looked also at where the staff came from, because clearly understanding their backgrounds is a key part of the story. And in terms of the sort of, we're always a bit uncomfortable with the notions around war for talent, but there is definitely a certain amount of sort of cross-bank poaching going on at the moment. What we can see is that the vast majority of that poaching takes place within a region. So most people are recruiting people from within their banks and within their geographies. I think the geography challenge means that actually one of the few areas where there is a significant shift is UK banks to US banks. And actually there's a general theme. If you look at, for example, alumni of UK universities, they're also more likely to end up in US banks. So there's a clear sense of that happening. A lot of that is the London story. But if we then dive down into the individual markets, we can see some clear sort of predators, if you like, emerging. So Wells Fargo, for example, has been a very strong poacher of talent across the space. We noticed, for example, in Charlotte, the Bank of America headquarter city, they've done a really good job of poaching quite a lot of staff there. So you can see a strong sense of these quite interesting local stories that are emerging around some of the talent battles. In the other markets, some of the players are quite obvious. RBC, clearly the leader in the Canadian market, on the index at least, is also the biggest source, biggest place where people are most likely to move to from some of the other banks. In France, it's BNP Paribas, and the UK, roughly it's HSBC. But if you dive into some of the level of detail below that, so for example, looking at AI Dev, which in the UK has got relatively small numbers, Standard Chartered emerges as the leader. That's quite a small content base, so we're going to keep tracking this. But some very interesting, quite detailed stories that we're seeing as we see where the story emerges. And obviously, as we track things like talent, track things like salary, we hope to begin to build a more nuanced and sophisticated story around what's dragging people across banks in the space. And it's clearly something we want to keep a very close eye on. Next slide, please. The second biggest source of talent for banks is actually IT consulting firms. And I see Quantum Black is not on that list, but what we can see is that actually a lot of the all those top 10 firms are pretty much either consulting firms or likely the consulting arms of IT firms, so IBM and so on. Will have very much the consulting teams who are being focused on that. Now, some of that reflects the importance of India. So Tata Consulting, obviously, the vast majority of that talent is happening in India. I think it's fair to say that, well, we wouldn't call this poaching because a lot of consulting firms are usually quite happy when their alumni end up at some of their big clients. And so clearly there may be more of a revolving door between the various groups of people to make sure this happens. We don't yet see much sign of big tech. So we're hoping that obviously the data over time may change as Jeremy mentioned some of those layoffs. We may begin to see some of those people emerging in our banking sector. We're also, for what it's worth, tracking where people leave to go to. It's very early data, but interesting at the moment, the single biggest place that people from banks go to is Amazon. So we may see more of a swap over happening between the big tech and the banks as we play this forward. The third place is actually universities. And we've tracked a lot of the talent in terms of where they're coming from. The world's leading university for having alumni in the banking sector is the University of Toronto, but we can see places like Columbia and a whole series of Indian universities as well, also being places that deliver talent into the university sector. And clearly so there's a lot of change happening and a lot of opportunity. Thank you. Back to you, Alexandra.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. So interesting. I mean, obviously there's only so much we can share on this call today, only having 45 minutes, but looking at the list of universities that do go and academics that do go into banks and looking at where those are drawn from across the US universities and the UK and across Europe, it's really interesting. Georgia Tech, I think, shows up. Is that right, Tim? Georgia Tech is one of the big ones. And
I think it's number 3, definitely the US universities. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So it's interesting. And from I think it is a sort of a growing. It's still small, but there's a trend is that it's growing towards taking from academia rather than declining, which I also thought was quite interesting. Not across all banks, but in some of the banks in the top 10 in our index. I don't know, before I hand back over to Annabelle, I just wanted, Jeremy, did you want to comment on sort of where you've seen, you were mentioning big tech before. I mean, it's not necessarily showing up in the sort of volume here in the in this slide, but I just wondered if you wanted to comment on where you see banks are drawing from, sort of maybe more anecdotally.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very broad. I mean, I think the volume in India, as you pointed out, Tim, is not surprising. And of course, as everyone on the call knows, there's often quite close relationships between, in-house and outsourced teams. So there's good contacts there. So at the volume end, that doesn't really surprise me. I think the more interesting thing to look at over time would be the more senior, the leadership type of people and how they're moving around. I mean, there's a CDO, a chief data officer at a European bank who previously worked at Electronic Arts, for example. I mean, I think those kind of moves are really quite interesting, which obviously is a much narrower sliver than this. But I think that's the kind of interesting thing to track more in the future. I would say, though, that, part of the trick here for all of us and for all the banks is actually becoming an attractive place for this talent and creating these kind of communities. And so creating an identity out of all of these different sources and a mission, I think, is a really important part of the job. And I actually think on your next slide, that's going to be relevant to that as well. So
let's go into the next slide, handing over to Annabelle.
Yeah, this is the final slide for anyone that's getting overwhelmed by data. This is just about AI research. So in July, we're publishing a major innovation report where we'll be digging down into this in much more detail. But essentially, we see most of the banks that we're covering have AI research capacity in some way. These are just the top 10. So this is looking at the total, and this is based on Google Scholar. So it's research that gets published publicly. And this is just the total volume of citations. So we've included Ant Financial in this just for an interesting reference point. And it's interesting to see how much research Ant Financial is doing. We know JP Morgan Chase has a very strong AI research team, sort of 200, 250 people working there. RBC has Borealis AI that they have been building for the last 7 years. Interesting to see Visa also strong capability of AI research. Capital One, a new sort of contender coming into the index in November, and TD Bank with Layer 6. And I think, there's something interesting about building these research teams. I guess the first thing is we tend to find fewer research teams in European banks. Although in this latest data set, I think we found 25 banks where we have found evidence of at least, 3 or so people working in those AI research roles. And it's something that in conversations with the banks, it's definitely an area that the European banks are thinking, should we be focusing on this more? But I guess why are banks doing this research? I guess there's one argument, which is, if we keep on the forefront of pure AI research, we'll be able to deploy that at some point in sort of and apply that in the AI tools and products that we're building. But there's definitely, I think, Jeremy, where you were going, is there's a broader point about sort of community and talent attraction and fostering a culture where you have people at the forefront of AI innovation really being in the bank and then going and participating in academic conferences and speaking in almost like a peer-to-peer community where you can then attract the talent in the best way. And I think there are other reasons as well. We often hear people saying that if you have these people in the bank, they'd almost become a sort of hub where people with more technical expert questions can go to and ask for advice. But also these people in these banks are sometimes best placed to be able to identify which vendors are best placed to work with externally. So I think the jury is still out whether you need to be investing in hundreds of person strong research teams focused on AI, but definitely an area that banks are doubling down on that we're seeing.
And Christina, it's a great question you have here on the topic of outsourcing. Any insights on the balance between internal versus external outsourced talent? And I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, Annabelle, but I mean, it's not something that we track. I mean, we look at build versus buy in terms of the tech stack. But in terms of talent, we're looking at what the banks have hired and affiliated with the banks. So, but it's a really, really good question. I don't know, Jeremy, if you've got some views on that question around external outsourced talent.
Well, I mean, you might have a better view from a data-driven perspective. I mean, anecdotally, I think there's nobody who hasn't got some mixture of it, and of course that makes sense. Again, I think it's hard to untangle individual banks context. We see some people who, just as they're very proud. And by the way, the other big thing I would say around this topic of papers and citations is recruiting. And again, it kind of, outsourcing, insourcing depends on your overall strategy and also your view of technology. I mean, my own view is we're going more and more towards open source in many areas, but it very much depends. The larger the organization, the more we would tend to see, a focus on a center of excellence in the middle, but then outsourcing for scale. And I think it's that the trick is building an operating model where you can combine both in your own context. I don't think there's an easy answer to that in my own experience.
Yeah. Agustina, I don't know if you want to jump in, if we can bring you in, or if that's enough, just message in the chat if you wanted to come in and have a longer conversation before we sign off on this webinar. But Gary, there's a question here from me. I'm just going to read it out. Is there any indication of whether AI responsibilities are being incorporated into developer and other technologist roles rather than being siloed within the typical data science and data science oriented roles departments? That's an interesting one. I don't know, Annabelle or Tim, if you want to touch on that.
Sorry. I think we're seeing a different mix in terms of the education that's happening across the piece. And clearly some of the banks we're talking to are doing quite a lot of work to educate people more broadly on this. And that's something that we're keen to follow up on. We obviously have another pillar on this, which is going to be looking at this more closely sort of later in the year, sort of report out, I think, in the next few months, covering this in some more detail.
Well, I would say on this one, I think, Gary, it's a great question. And I think most of us now, if we're in this space at all, and it's particularly important for banks and anyone with either a regulatory exposure or a sensitive customer base, is that an element of training and sensitizing people to these issues as being core to everything we do and building into the culture is definitely, I think, becoming best practice everywhere. It's not quite answering your question. I think there's then the question of layering expertise, which to a certain extent you can do with technology, obviously. But I think training people in best practice is something which everybody is going to be doing pretty soon, if they're not already.
Yeah, It's it's something that comes up in every conversation with the banks that we have too, is that and also the way we track it is looking at very visible, distinct roles in responsible AI, which is important, right? Because it sits across many of the banks, but it is, the question about baking it into to the developer side, and sort of, but also from an outside end, and how, we would love comments, by the way, sort of in general, sort of how one would tackle that from an outside in approach. But it's a great question, Gary. Thank you so much for that. But I think, I think we're actually 2 minutes over, but we can stay open for any further questions. Please put them in the chat, and we'll bring them into this group and answer them as best we can. But really wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone. Thank you, Tim and Annabelle and Jeremy, for running through and commenting on all of the data. The report is, well, it's a very detailed report on the AI talent. We run through just some of the key findings, but please do read through it and come back to us with any questions. I would say it's actually, long as it was even longer a few weeks ago, and there's a lot of data that underpins all the talent analysis that we do and underpins the index overall. As Annabelle said, we're going to be producing a innovation report in July, where we're going to go into as much detail as we've done on the talent report. We're going to look at, for innovation, we're going to be looking at research, we're going to be looking at patents, we're going to be looking at ventures, we're looking at open source ecosystems. We're going to be running some interviews with banks in terms of really teasing out this build versus buy and the accelerators of AI implementation. So I really look forward to sharing that with you and getting your comments on that. And we'll have another webinar on the results of that, but we'll distribute the report and give everyone a heads up when it's out. And then following that, we're going to be doing a leadership report. And we're probably going to combine leadership and responsible AI, or do them as separate, but it's all leading up to our November 9 release of the updated and expanded index that will be released on either November 8 or November 9, where we're going to go to covering 60 banks. And I wanted to say a huge thanks to everyone on the Evident team for all the hard work on gathering this data. We'll be continuing in the engine room of gathering data. Please, everyone, do get in touch if you've got any questions for any of us. Thank you very much.